In the beginning. This is Genesis, the first chapter, verse 1 through the second chapter, verse 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning of day one. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let the dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and he gathered the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and weeks and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. This is the word of the Lord.
Spring semester of 2018 was a very difficult time for me, spiritually mostly. I had just finished my fall semester of 2017 with Systematic Theology 1, and I was getting into Systematic Theology 2 in my spring semester. And, questions that theology students ask, like, does faith come first, or does justification happen first? Is baptism required if someone accepts Christ? When does someone receive the Holy Spirit? Is it during baptism? Is it someone when hears the faith? Or is it when someone receives Christ? When does regeneration happen? And thinking of all that, I started seeing some cracks in my belief. I was teaching a class here in Hebrews where we were studying how Jesus is over the angels that God created and everyone else. But on the other side, there were certain moments when I was thinking, is Jesus really real? Is he, or was he just one of the great magicians or the miracle workers that emerged during that time? And my faith it's a gift of God. I think I have mentioned to a lot of people here. From a very small age, there was, like many people say that, during this time of my life, I met Jesus or something. But I had a God-fearing heart from the time I started knowing God, or from the time I started going to church. And over 30 years of strong faith just started trembling a little bit. And regularly I would go home and I would be on my knees praying to God and crying out, what's happening? If I come to a school in theology, I should be becoming more stronger in faith rather than becoming weak. I remember when I first came here, I think it was my second day here, I was in Dr. Parker's class, and Margie said that seminary is sometimes like a cemetery where people come to strengthen their faith but end up kind of going away from faith. So at the end of summer, last year, after finishing my internship, there were just 2 weeks left for my summer or the fall semester to begin. I received a notification that one of the professors actually changed his class timing or switched to a different day altogether. And that was a class of my major, so I had to take that class, and in order to do that, I had to change some other classes. And Genesis was the only option that I had because of the other classes were already filled, or it was not getting into my schedule of my work and everything that I had required to do. Then I thought a lot. Genesis was at 7:30 a.m. I think 2 days a week, and I'm not a morning person. So it's just very difficult for me to get up at 6 a.m. and then travel to campus to be able to get the 7:30 a.m. class. And then I thought, I have read Genesis all my life, like a couple of times I have read it through the book. I know from end to end. I really don't need the book of Genesis. But I think that was God's humor, and he was kind of telling me, stop being so dramatic, Mithun. I got this. I'll take care of you and your faith and everything in it, and you don't have to worry about it. So I took the class on Genesis, and studying the book of Genesis from new lenses opened up my eyes, and I saw the beauty that God did in the creation that I had never studied before. I was in awe of God, and by the end of the semester, I felt a certain kind of calling. And so today I want to share that awe which I received from God with you. So before we get into the book, I would like to mention a couple of things about Genesis. First of all, the book of Genesis is a prologue of the entire Bible, and Genesis 1 is basically an introduction for the rest of the book of Genesis. Theologically, it can be divided into two parts. The first part is Genesis 1:1 through 11:25, that establishes the need of redemption for humankind. And Genesis 11:26 to 11:27 to chapter 50, verse 26, is the delineating path of redemption that God draws for us. So in the first part of Genesis, in Genesis 1 through 1 until 2 through 25, is a period of, basically we call it as the absence of sin, where there is no sin. And then we understand like how beautiful the world God created, wanted it to be for the humans. And so God wanted to create a world that was perfect for mankind until it fell into sin. Now, speaking of perfection, when we are going through this book, we have to keep one number in mind. Can anyone say what that number is? The number 7. Yep, very good, Olivia. So number 7 is something that we can trace all through the book of basically the creation. And not only that, the theme of 7 can be seen all through the Bible, basically. Okay. And the book of Genesis was written in the Hebrew language. So during our semester, we took a couple of weeks to study just chapter 1. But I will not be getting into like every single detail of the book. But some things which I felt was important that helped me recover through the time that I went through my faith. And I felt that would be important just to share with you all. So oftentimes we think Genesis actually begins with Genesis 1:1. So if I read Genesis 1, verses 1 to 3, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." Now, if you look very carefully in the book of Genesis, whenever God is creating something, he did it suddenly and completely. So every day he spoke something and that happened. Let's say he said, "Let there be vegetation," and the vegetation occurred right away. Then why do we see in Genesis 1 it says that the earth was formless and empty? Through this, we can understand that the earth's creation did not actually start in Genesis. And it says, the first word says, "In the beginning, God created." Now, when it says in the beginning, does the beginning mean for us or does it mean for God? We know God has no beginning and no end. So when it says in the beginning, it basically means that it's in the beginning of the human creation and not of the entire universe or anything. So in the book of Job, chapter 38, verse 4 to 7, I'll just read that to you. It says, so God is questioning Job about his struggles. And it says, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. So here, God is talking about creation when he was creating or laying the foundation of the earth. And we see here, it already says that the angels shouted for joy. So the angels, or the water, which we see in Genesis 1 to 2, was already created. And sometimes we think, then why is not all the information or the detail provided in Genesis? But the clause to that is, after every creation, God said something. What was that? Can anyone say? That it was good. So God created something and God said that it was good. Now, the clause lies here in the narration of Genesis is when it says God saw that it was good. It did not necessarily mean that the creation, whatever God created, was beautiful. Definitely, we know whatever God created is definitely beautiful. But the root word for saw is basically a Hebrew word which means to provide. So when Hagar was in the desert and she said that God will provide, it's the same key word that is used, or the root word of Hebrew that is used whenever it says God saw that it was good. Abraham, while going to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac asked, so where are we going to get the sacrifice for? And Abraham said to Isaac that God will provide. The word provide is the same root of the word in Hebrew is the same as every time when God said, when the scripture says that God saw it was good. So basically, when the book of Genesis was written, what God had in mind was a perfect home for humans to live in, or basically his best creation. So whenever it says that God saw it was good, what he meant was that God provided whatever was good for humankind. So that's the reason we do not find everything in Genesis described. We might say, oh, we don't see dinosaurs created in Genesis, or we don't see some other things that, we see so many things in the world, there's so many things in nature, but we always don't see why is it's not created or not written about in the book of Genesis in Genesis 1. So, as I said, the only intent that we read through Genesis was mentioned whatever was necessary for the good of humankind. We'll get into the chapter now. So we know there were 6 days of creation, right? And the 7th day God rested from whatever he created. But the act of creation was 7 and not 6. There are some repetitions in some days, so we'll quickly go through them. So the first act of creation was in verses Genesis 1, 3 to 5. It says God created light on day 1. Then the second act of creation was on creating the sky on the 2nd day. So I'll go to the 3rd day of creation, which is a little interesting. So on the 3rd day of creation, there were 2 acts of creation. First, there was the land and the seas, and then the second was the vegetation. Now, in regards to the vegetation, so let me read verses 9 and 10. So it says, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered water he called the seas, and God saw that it was good. That was the first act of creation on day 3. Now the second act of creation, it says, God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. The land produced vegetation. Now here there are 2 kinds of vegetations that mentioned. One is plant-bearing seed, which is basically cultivable plants that can be consumed by man, And the second is trees that bear fruit with seed in it, which can also be consumed by man. But on day 3, there was a third kind of vegetation that was also created, which we see in, basically, if you study verse 29 and 30, it says, God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. So those are the two kinds that we studied God created on the third day. And then it says, to all the beasts of the earth, and to all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. So that was the third kind of vegetation that was also created on the third day, but it was not mentioned until day 6. And the reason why, again, is because that was not necessary for man. That was created for, basically, the beasts. Now, going back to day 4, verses 14 to 19, God created stars and lights. And two things that we need to keep in mind here. One is it says, so through the narration of Genesis, it keeps on saying that God said, let there be so and so, and then it was. But when we come to this verse, verse 16, it says God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. So here it does not only say that God said, and then there was lights, but it said God made light. And the reason why it says that is because God knew there would be a time when humans might start worshiping those lights. We know in Egyptian cultures and in Near Eastern religions, even in India, like people worship the moon and the sun and everything like created. God knew before even God created human beings that they will at some point start worshipping the creation rather than the creator. And that's the reason why it was very important to make a note as made, so that people understand that God created them just as God created human beings, and they should not be worshipped. The second point here in this day 4, in many of the translations, it says, let's see, verse 14, it says, let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Now, the root word for signs in the Hebrew Bible stands for miracle, and the root word, it's called otot, O-T-O-T, and for seasons, the Hebrew word is mo'adim, which basically means appointed times or holy days. So from this we can understand is when God created the stars and the sun and the moon, he had certain things in mind. We know that the miracle or the appointed times were basically used in the Old Testament, basically in the Pentateuch, to be able to set out some days that were required for festivals like the Day of Atonement or sacrificial days and other things. So it was the gracious and the loving heart of God, the Creator, that before he created human beings, he already realized that they would sin. And as signposts of their post-fall redemption, God already created the stars and whatever is in the celestial body so that they will have their appointed feast in able to plead or to be able to take care of their redemption. And this was even before God created human beings. Moving on to day 5, verses 20 to 23, we all know about living creatures of the sea. I would like to draw my attention to something which says, in verse 21, it says, so God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving kind. Okay, moving thing, with which the water teems. So we all know what the great creatures or maybe whatever is living in the sea is. But what does it mean when it says great creatures of the sea? So during that time, great creatures of the sea could be something that you could call basically marine dinosaurs. Now, if you thought that Genesis does not have description of dinosaurs created, Penelope was talking to me last week about this. So there are a couple of verses in the scripture. One is Job 41, verses 1 and 2. Okay. So Job 41, 1 and 2 says, "Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fish hook, or tie down his tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook?" So the word Leviathan is basically used in the Near Eastern times for very, very huge creatures or animals, which we now basically call as dinosaurs. So a couple of verses, if you want to check later on for your reference, would be Psalms 74, verses 14, Psalm 104, verse 26, and Isaiah 27, verse 1. So I'll quickly read something from my professor's commentary here. Recent archaeological evidence has shown that among the people of ancient Ugarit, a coastal city just north of biblical Canaan, that flourished precisely during the time of the Israelite conquest, that is around 450 to 1200 BC, Leviathan, which is in Ugaric, pronounced as Lotan or Lighton, was viewed and revered as the god of the sea. In ancient Egypt, moreover, the smallest species of tanin, it's a Hebrew word tanin, crocodiles were epitomized as an object of worship in the crocodile god Sobek. So from this, we can understand that there were larger creatures that were created when God created the heavens or God created the earth. But many a times we do not know about it, or sometimes people ask us, so why don't we see dinosaurs in creation? How did God skip that? But God never skipped it. It's there, but we just need to do a little bit of research to find out about it. Now we come to day 6. That's very important. So, day 6, verse 24. "And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good." So that's one creation. And the second creation that actually God did on the 6th day, God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and of the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So as we are studying through it, and then we saw that number 7 was very important in the scripture. So the 7th creation was basically, well, the crowning act of God's creation, that is to create the human beings. And there are two things to notice. So as I said, Genesis 1 is an introduction to the rest of the book of Genesis. And from Genesis 2, we see the creation of Adam and Eve. So when we see the creation of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2, it's basically highlighting or zooming into Genesis 1, 26 and 27, where God created man. But we should realize that definitely the male was created first and then the female. But when God created man in his own image, in his own likeness, the image of God is imbibed in equally, both in male and female. I think that's something we should not forget. As Christians, I think we definitely hold that, but world outside might not think it that way, and so that's the thing which I wanted to highlight. And the second thing was, as God created his whole creation was with the focus of creating human beings. We see when God said, after his creation, God saw in verse 31, God saw that all that he had made, and it was very good. So the word very he added to the rest of the scripture, basically to good, which we don't see in the earlier verses. And so from this we can understand, like, when God created the entire other world, he definitely had the humans in mind, and he wanted that to be a perfect place. He also knew that they are going to sin, and so before even he created humans, he already created checkposts that would help humans for redemption. According to the Hebrew Bible, I will read something here quickly. So, going through verses through the first chapter, we definitely saw that there were points when God created everything that was good for humankind that God wanted to provide. But the literary way of how Genesis was written, according to my professor, it's one of the most brilliant things that anyone can ever write, and it might take a lifetime for someone to write Genesis 1. And here's the reason why. So there was a scholar by the name of Umberto Cassuto. He's an Israeli scholar. I don't know if John has read about him. His commentary of Genesis 1 says about, I'll just read through this paragraph. So this section, Genesis 1, is divided into 7 paragraphs, one for each day. Each of the 3 foundational nouns in this section, that is Elohim, which is God, land, and sky, occur a multiple of 7 times. That is, God occurs 35 times, land occurs 21 times, and sky occurs 21 times. So all in the multiples of 7. The expression, and God saw that it was good, occurs 7 times. There are 7 acts of creation preceding the crowning event of man's creation, and each of these 7 acts is initiated by the expression, let there be. Note that the creation of man is the only act that God doesn't verbalize, but in fact performs physically, on which, when God, for all the creation, it says God said, and then things happened. But when God came to human beings, he said, let us make man in our image. He did not say that, God said that, let there be human beings, but he said, let us make humans. There are 7 words in the Hebrew text of verse 1. So in the Hebrew text, there are 7 words. There are 14 words in the Hebrew text of verse 2, again multiple of 7. The word lights or day and day occur altogether 7 times in the first paragraph. The expression of waters occur altogether 7 times in paragraphs 2 and 3. The expression living creature occurs altogether 7 times in paragraphs 5 and 6. The 3 center sentences of the 7th paragraph contain 7 words each. The total number of words in the 7th paragraph is 35, which is 5 times 7. And the point of all this structural emphasis on the number 7, consistent with the import of this number throughout the Bible, is clearly to highlight the perfection and completeness of the home that God made for man. And there's one which I want to add to it, is that if you take the 7th letters until the 49th letter, which is 7 times 7 of Genesis 1 in the Hebrew Bible, if you add those up, that basically creates a word called Torah, T-O-R-A-H. So that's how beautifully the book of Genesis has been written. But like me, all these years that I have read Genesis again and again, I probably overlooked through it. Now coming back to my struggle, during this semester while I was studying through all this, I probably gained stronger or greater strength in my faith. And in Genesis 2, when God talks about creating Eden, oftentimes we do not know that when God gave the Israelites the orders to create the tabernacle, basically going to the temple, it's exact the same way that the Garden of Eden was created. And there are a lot of things that I studied in Genesis, like why Noah was named Noah, why Abraham moved in a particular direction, and was Abraham really faithful to God all his years, or it was only at a certain point? How much unconditional God's love was, and his covenant was so much unconditional according to what Abraham actually did, in spite of knowing all the covenant. So when we were studying this book, and when we were studying about the tabernacle, especially the Garden of Eden, and comparing it with the temple, that was the time when my alarm kind of went off, and something in my mind that said, like, I want to serve you in this tabernacle, and that's the reason why you're here. I had probably lost, as I said, going through a dark time in my faith, but God was all through it, and then he made me realize at that moment, like, the professor is teaching, but my mind was somewhere else. And then probably I would say I would regain my faith and my calling. So I hope this was encouraging to a lot of people, those who are going through a lot of struggles. It may be you might be physically struggling, you might be emotionally struggling, you might be financially struggling. And a lot of times we have confusion whether God is really real, whether this faith is really important or not. And we take two directions. Like for me, I took a direction of like kneeling down and praying and crying to the Lord, like, what's going on? If Modi is not a place for me, just take me out. I'll go back to India. That's all. I don't want to stay here if that's taking me away from my God. And there are other people, those who lose faith and move on to the world. And I hope going through this passage, as much as maybe I was not able to moderate it very well, but I hope it has given you encouragement to know that you have a loving and caring Father who intended to make the best place for you to live in, for each one of us. And though he knew that we would fall in sin, he yet provided his Son so that he is able to make atonement. And then at the end, when we read Revelation, we see that we'll go back to the initial state that God intended, where there'll be no sorrow, no pain, and no crying, but only worshiping him together.
When my faith to stand gets a little bit weaker, where could I run to? Where could I go? Even when it feels like my world is shaking, even when I've had all that I can take, I know you never let me go. Even when I'm caught in the dead of night, even when I'm caught in the dead of night, I know no matter how it ends, you're with me even then. When the days up ahead look a little bit brighter, but the grip of the past holds a little bit tighter, I'm reminded your grace never asked for perfection. I'm restored 'cause I'm yours and I stand forgiven. But where could I run to? Where could I go? Even when it feels like my world is shaking, even when I've had all that I can take, I know you never let me go. And even when the waters won't stop rising, even when I'm caught standing on your promises, and I know that even in the thick of the battle, even in the valley of the shadow, you alone are my defense. When I'm standing on your promises, so where could I run to? Where could I go? Even when it feels like my world is shaking, even when I've had all that I can take, I know you never let me go. Even when I'm caught in the dead of night, and even when the waters won't stop rising, I know you never let me go. You never let me go. You're with me